phone to silent. I've been caught out before.
And do we need to turn that on?
Oh, I haven't done that yet, have I? Sorry, I thought I'd done that. Yep, that should be it. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Can you hear me all right? Is that picking up? Yes? No? Oh, is that better? Okay, just re-angle slightly. Welcome, and thank you for coming out this evening. Kate, is this the fourth time we've welcomed you to Main Street?
It might. I mean, you know that I would actually just move in here. I never want to leave.
Well, I feel we're very spoiled because you've come.
I only keep writing books just to come back.
We'll take it every day. But we're so lucky that you're here. First, just for one night, up and down. So hugely appreciated.
I love it. No, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. So honoured, I was just about to say. So yes, thank you for doing the welcome. Before I carry on, just quickly on the phones, turn them to silent. I'm so used to doing the admin, not the chat, that I forgot my admin job. If there's a fire alarm, we go out the way we came in. So we can chat. So in essence, for the way the event's going to go, we'll chat for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So I really should start at the beginning, Kate. I had the luxury of reading your book in a day yesterday, which never happens, but it was just such a treat. What I wanted to know, because it's such an interesting tapestry that you've drawn, is how it evolved. Where did the sort of where did it start? What was the kernel?
So it was basically a total self-indulgence, because I have had this long ambition to build a house, which obviously my husband thinks is completely ludicrous, because if I try and put a shelf up, that falls down. So imagine what the house will be like. But I'm fascinated by kind of off-grid living. I just love, and I'm kind of fascinated by how you build something that then becomes a home. You know, what transfers a building, or indeed a van, or, you know, people live in all sorts of different things. What makes it a home? And I'm really nervous about building this house, because the last house that we lived in London, we bought, it was derelict. So it was kind of as near as it could be to building your own house, except that we just worked really hard and gave literally every penny we earned to a bunch of Irish builders to try and build it for us. And it took about 18 months, and we lived on people's sofas, and, you know, all our stuff was in somebody's kind person's garage. And so we had that sense of rootlessness in that time, which was very discombobulating. And it was therefore, you know, to move into this house that was going to be perfect. And it had, you know, we had a sort of wish list. So I love cooking. As you know, I've banged on about cooking here in the past. But I grew up in a house where the kitchen was this wide. Mum said that was the only reason she stayed so thin, is that if she got any fatter, she wouldn't be able to move around the kitchen, and no one else would be able to be in there helping her. So so we had this sort of it was a proper galley kitchen. And then, you know, you live in student houses and things, and I'd say I love cooking, but I hate feeling like the galley slave. You know, you want people to sort of come and chat at least, and maybe actually do a bit of something useful at the same time. So I wanted a sort of sociable kitchen. So we were going to have a sociable kitchen. Bookshelves, of course, most important
essential
thing. You know, and so we were able to create it was our perfect house. And I remember walking in thinking, thank goodness, you know, bit of builder's dust and everything, but we're going to put our pictures up and dig everything out of storage. And oh my goodness, I'd forgotten we had that. And, you know, we had my grandmother's quite ugly chintz sofa, but I loved it, and it was quite comfy, and, you know, it was in the right place, and it wasn't home. And it was so weird. And I just thought, what have I done wrong? And we lived there for 7 years in the end, although I was doing a lot of travelling for work at the time. So I would I'd extend trips. It's terrible. I'd just abandon Ludo. my very patient husband, and say, well, I might just stay out, you know, for another week, and I just couldn't. And when I was at home, I drove him even more mad because I'd be like moving furniture, painting things a different, or maybe it's the colours wrong, and it just never felt like home. And I didn't know why. I couldn't work out why. And when I started writing this book, I thought, it really came from, if I am going to build this house, how do I know I'm not going to make that mistake again? And so what is it that makes a home? What is it that actually, as I say, transforms a place that might have your bed in and your clothes in to, a sort of practical space, to the place that you yearn for or that you feel safe in? And what is it that constitutes home for everybody else? So, as I say, it was a massively self-indulgent project. But I thought I'll write a list of people that I think will give me a kind of unique perspective or their perspective of home. And then maybe once I've gathered all this information, I'll be able to come up with a sort of thesis. Very bad idea. I mean, what's happening? And instead, what happened was I came up with I think, hopefully you agree, hopefully you'll agree, the most incredible stories. They're not my stories, they're their stories. And I just thought, I don't need a thesis. These stories
they speak for themselves.
They speak for themselves.
Yes, I mean, that's the thing. You don't need to be prescriptive, do you?
No.
They kind of emerge almost perfectly formed.
Yeah.
And that is the joy of the book.
Well, it was such a lovely thing to do. It was a lovely realisation to think. And I did worry that it was going to be very short because everyone would say, well, if I've got nice neighbours and my cat, it's home. And I thought, that's not going to make a book. But actually, it turned out to be an incredibly rich and varied and fascinating subject.
So is it a bit like scratching the surface and then finding lots of unexpected treasure?
Yeah.
Which was your sort of eureka moment with sort of realising that was the way it was going? Who was your discovery at that point?
I think it was actually after I'd done all the chatting and I started writing. So I remember there was a lovely quote that Rebecca Solnit wrote in a book, Wanderlust, about writing. And she said, the problem with being a writer in a sort of, production-driven society is that it looks like you're doing almost nothing most of the time, and you're not allowed to do almost nothing. So that's why she walks, because she does a lot of it is in your head. And so she said, I walk because it looks like you're doing something, but it's as close to nothing as you can get away with, and then you can think. So for me, it was, I gathered all the stories, and then started thinking, and kind of. I love doing jigsaws. It's my kind of, I'm mildly obsessed with jigsaws. It's my way of sorting my brain out. So it was like doing a jigsaw. So I thought, well, I have no idea what this book is going to be. I have no idea how these stories are going to work. I have no idea whether they are going to be individual short stories or whether there will be something that will be a narrative that works. I had no idea. So I thought, approach it like a jigsaw. But first of all, you have to create the physical jigsaw pieces. So I started writing the stories, and I'd had the idea right at the start of wanting to bring in the natural world somehow. And I wasn't quite sure how, but I thought, there's something about home and territory that's really important to certain species of animal. And I thought maybe there'll be parallels, maybe there'll be something we can learn from the natural world. And as I was writing up the human stories, there'd be little things I'd think, oh, gosh, that's like, that's like this animal.
Well, the badgers, I couldn't believe.
The badger is
the longevity of the sets.
It's the most wonderful story, isn't it? So I was working in Shetland last year, which is a place I love, as this lady in the front knows. And I was croft sitting for somebody, and this was when I was sort of trying to put the
By the way, it's a very good concept, croft sitting.
Who
doesn't want to croft sit?
It does make you realise that actually knowing what to do with a sheep can have its upsides. I mean, you don't smell great, but it does mean you get nice jobs like, could you come and look after my sheep on my croft on Walser? Yes, please, thank you very much. And while I was there, I was sort of writing endless lists about who I might include. And I was really interested by the idea of talking to somebody who'd always lived in the same place and had never moved away. Because something that I had researched was, I looked at what's the sort of average number of homes that people will live in over a lifetime in the UK. Anyone want to have a guess?
12.
Quite close. 14.
Wow.
I know. Which I was quite surprised by. But then if you think of sort of student flats and, it's not I'm moving, from one mansion to another. It's, it's all those. So I thought, well, how does somebody view home if it's one place that they've, that's the only place they've ever known? And I thought Shetland's actually quite a good place to find somebody like that, because lots of people are very, very rooted to their crofts. Particularly the crofters. And I was at a party. It was super glamorous, because I am quite glamorous, in a shearing shed. And I got talking to this lovely girl, Karen, and she said, "Oh, you need to talk to my dad. He was physically born in the croft that he still lives in. He's in his early 70s now, and you should go and talk to him." So I went to talk to him. Willie Dool, he's called. He's an absolutely lovely man, and his wife Jacqueline, who's incredibly patient. And when I sort of asked him about home, he was slightly like, "Really know what you're talking about?" Because he was so, he'd never had to question home. That was just it. That was where he totally belonged. And he told me a story. I mean, it made me laugh. I said, do you go on holiday? Not much. He'd been to Yell, which is another island, and he had been to Glasgow. So unlikely to see Dolly Parton. Really? It was just.
No, I love that.
And he said, "Oh, she was so far away. We might as well have watched her on the telly." But he said, and I said, so, and he said it was all right. But he said, that really, and he said, "I've been all over Shetland," because he's like most crofters, he does about 100 different jobs, one of which is fencing. He goes and fences all over Shetland. He said, "I've been to Papastor, I've been to the Skerries, I've been everywhere." And he said, "I can tell you, there is nowhere better on Shetland than going over the top." And I went, "What's going over the top?" And going over the top is, he's on Muckle Row in the west of the main island, and you drive to get to his croft. You drive down a single track lane, and it sort of follows the coast. It's beautiful. There's a sort of the sound here, and you follow it, and the lane does a little rise, and then it drops down. His croft's there. That's going over the top.
Hard to argue, really.
Yeah, hard to argue. But what I particularly loved about the kind of family history and what has happened to the croft, because they don't own it. They're tenants. And this is, you think, do you have to own your home? No, you don't, it turns out. For lots of people, ownership is neither here nor there. Because he said, and this is what I just loved, he said, every generation of Dools has, if there's been an extra child, they've just built an extra room onto the croft. Or if someone got a bit more money and they had a few more cows, they built another barn. And so essentially the croft now is like the physical embodiment of the family's history. Everything is connected to, oh, well, that great uncle so-and-so built that, and, Auntie Blah lived there, and someone was born in there. And so it's sort of like a 3D photo album, in a way. Yeah. And it made me think of badgers. Bear with me. So badgers do the same thing. They will often live in a set for generations, and if there are more cubs one year, they'll just dig another chamber, exactly like the Dools. And I discovered that there's a set it's in Sussex, I think, that's been studied for years and years and years, and they've been doing DNA tests on the badgers in that set, and they're all related, and it's the same family that's lived in that set for 200 years. So the badgers and the dools. Do you see
Spiritual
what
brothers.
I did there? So, and it was really, it was lovely because I actually, without trying terribly hard, found, animal equivalents to a lot of the human stories, and they just sort of, and it amused me anyway.
I particularly enjoyed the house hunting for hermit crabs.
Oh yes, yes, the property ladder.
To find the right
Yes.
replacement shell.
Yeah. So hermit crabs do this thing, and it is like a property ladder. So everyone knows a hermit crab, don't you? And you know that they don't have their own shells. So actually, they look like rather nasty, sort of prawny, sort of spider crab hybrid things, until they get into their shell. And but because the shell isn't their own, and they've just taken a shell that they've found, obviously it doesn't necessarily fit as they grow. So if you're a snail, brilliant, you're born with your shell and it grows with you. But if you're a hermit crab, you have to move out of your shell when you outgrow it, and you have to find another one. And sometimes that can be quite difficult, finding the right shell. And so someone, I can't remember who, it was the most amazing piece of research, noticed that, because there'd be an empty shell, and there might be like 15 hermit crabs all going for it. Right, we're going to get that shell. And a hermit crab doesn't want to be without a shell because they're quite tasty if you're a gull or something. So that, this needs to happen speedily, otherwise, they're lunch. So this thing happens where you'll get hermit crabs of all different sizes, and they swap shells. So basically, you'll have the big shell, which is too big for, Eric at the back, but is perfect for Ernie at the front. So, and then there's a couple of others in the middle. And so, Ernie at the front kicks off the shell that he's grown out of and goes into the big one. And then the next one takes Ernie's shell, and so on. And they'll literally have this line of hermit crabs all going, it's like hand-me-downs. It's like, all the kids, isn't it? You've all outgrown your jumper and you hand it down the thing. It's like that. And it's the most amazing thing.
I love it.
Yeah.
No, just a very glorious image. Have you witnessed it at all?
I've seen hermit crabs find a shell, but I've never seen. I'd love to see that. It's one of those things you'd want to camp out on a beach for months just to, well,
definitely. Absolute joy. And so I suppose the other approach, or many different stories that you discovered, they're all so interesting and different in their own ways, but things were also part of it, weren't they? Home wasn't necessarily bricks and mortar.
Yeah.
It was sort of almost everything in between. It could be 4 cushions.
Yes.
How did that sort of emerge? I mean, the 4 cushions one particularly was quite poignant as a story. She had a tough old time.
She did have a tough old time.
But it worked every time with the cushions. I thought that was lovely.
Yeah.
Sort of,
it's. I think there's because I did imagine in a funny sort of way that things would be more. I was fascinated that things didn't take such a sort of centre stage as what makes a home as I thought they would. Again, I thought it would be one of those things that people would say, oh, it's my stuff. And a lot of the time it isn't stuff. So people like Barry and Wayne, who live on a boat off the west coast of Scotland at the moment. And Barry is a minimalist, complete minimalist. So he had no problem. Sorry, that's just got hooked up in the chaotic curls. There we are. So Barry is a total minimalist. I had no problem sort of downsizing from a house to a boat. Wayne has 200 pairs of trainers, which are still in a garage in Hull. And that's just the beginning. I mean, when he was telling me what he had. So, for him, the stuff he thought was important. What was interesting was then, moving onto a boat and realising that it wasn't. But for Alice, who you're talking about with the 4 cushions, this is an astonishing woman who found herself, she was basically made bankrupt by her then husband, got involved in a fraud case and went to prison and left her with basically all the debts that she couldn't afford to pay. And so she ended up bankrupt. It's not a dissimilar situation to Rain and Win. I'm sure many of you have read The Salt Path, which is a beautiful book if you haven't read it. I think it might be for sale in a very good bookshop near here.
It is possible.
But she wrote so poignantly about how homelessness can come to anybody. And that's what happened to Alice, you know. So she found herself homeless and bankrupt. And when you're bankrupt, it's really difficult to get out of it because, you know, you can't really earn money, because if you earn money, then that's all got to go to your debtors. And so it's this terrible kind of vortex of being stuck in poverty. And she ended up, you know, there were little things that helped her feel like she had a home even when she didn't have one. And she's always loved colour. Colour's a really important thing to her. And there were certain things that she'd managed to hold on to after the sort of bankruptcy basically cleared her out. And she was living in her parents' house, you know, so this is an adult woman with a child who is forced back to live with her parents, and was so miserable, and her parents were desperately upset, and as you can imagine, but kind of angry at her as well. It was almost like she felt they blamed her for the situation that they'd found themselves in. And happily, somebody she'd been at school with kind of got in contact, and he was living on a boat out in New Zealand. And he said, why don't you come? Why don't you and your son come and just be on the boat? And, you know, I'll look after you. And, you know, and she thought, she was so sort of uprooted by what had happened to her. And she thought, I will do this, I will go, but I need something that is going to make this place feel like home. And so she said, I had 4 cushion covers. I couldn't take the cushions. I was slightly hoping that someone had invented cushions in New Zealand, but I'd take the cushion covers with me. And she loves hares, funnily enough.
Yes, I
so
noted that.
I thought you would. And she had a little, you know, she had a little hare. So she brought her hare with her and her 4 cushion covers, and she knew then that the boat on the other side of the world could be home. So yes, there are certain things that are incredibly
sort of grounded her somehow.
Yeah.
In a very different situation, it reminded me a little bit though of when, because you describe your very idyllic kind of 70s childhood,
yes,
charging around the fields and knowing everyone around you, in a very, very sort of stable, secure, familiar, you know, sort of in a way the archetype of
yeah,
you know, the kind of a kind of sort of settled upbringing.
yeah.
But then absolute wanderlust hits, and you don't somehow need it because you've had it. Maybe is that how?
Well, it's yeah, and again, that was something that I sort of. I mean, it wasn't ever going to be a main theme of the book, but I did think it would help me sort of understand how I then created home later. Because as you say, you know, I had this the incredible joy and luck of having this very stable childhood. So I was born in 1968, and after about, Mum said after about 4 months or 5 months, she realised my parents were living in London, although they're both from Yorkshire, but they were living in London, you know, work and all that kind of stuff. And she said after about 4 or 5 months, she realised that London wasn't big enough for me. She said basically I had this feral thing I didn't quite know what to do with, so we thought we'll move to the countryside and put it in a field and see what happens. Best move ever. So, you know, I had this, and we lived, I mean, as you say, you know, I was growing up in the 70s, no one had invented health and safety, hooray. You know, it was entirely acceptable for you to be put outside and not allowed in until it was dark, and things like that. And of course there was no, I mean, telly was basically the test card with the odd programme in between. And, you know, obviously no social media or screens or any of those horrors. So you had to make your own fun. And it was wonderful. And, you know, I now realise what a privilege it is not only to have that sort of space and that sort of freedom, but also having parents who stayed together. You know, they were married until my dad died for 50-something years. So I did have this wonderful stability, and I do wonder whether it was that real, it's like an anchor, and I wonder whether it was that anchor that then made me feel safe enough and confident enough to disappear. And I interviewed, just prepare yourself for a massive name drop. I interviewed Tim Peake. Oh my goodness. I have astronaut crush. It's completely changed. I'm interviewing him in a couple of weeks because he's got a new book coming out.
Oh yes, that's right.
Yeah. And I'm interviewing him at Southwark Cathedral in a couple of weeks' time.
Oh, wow.
I'm like literally beside myself. I'm determined to become a space expert. I've got 2 weeks to do it. Anyway, so I interviewed him for this book because I thought, you know, someone who hasn't just left home but has left the planet is going to have, again, a really interesting perspective on what makes home and how you make home on a space station. How do you do that? You know, so... but it was really, we were laughing because our childhoods were very similar. We're almost the same age. And he grew up just outside Chichester, exactly the same situation, you know, same house for his whole childhood. I mean, he went even one step further because his parents, they loved the Ardèche in France. And they had a caravan. And every year they would go to the exact same place in France. But not only that, with half the neighbours in the street. So basically, his whole street would just then move to the Ardèche. So I mean, it literally couldn't have been more stable. And he was exactly the same. So the minute he left home, and same as me, he left home after he finished his A-levels. He said, I did really badly at school. Apparently teachers hate him when he goes and chats to, you know, kids, and he tells them how terribly badly he did in his A-levels, and the teachers go, don't tell them that. Don't tell them that. Anyway, and you know, and he wanted to be a pilot. That was what his burning ambition was, to be a pilot. And so it made sense to him to try and go into the army. And so when he left her at school, he then applied to go into the army, into the Air Corps. They said, we're not going to have you yet. You're too young and you haven't done anything apart from go to the Ardèche with all your mates. So go and have a bit more life first. And he went off actually and did Operation Raleigh, and he said it was completely formative and amazing. And then he went into, they wouldn't have him in the Air Corps. They said, go and do the infantry first. But so bearing in mind he's now in his early 50s, when I talked to him, he said, I've got my first mortgage. So it's a nightmare. And he's literally, because he's literally moved around constantly since he was 19. And you know, it's an army life. Yeah. And then when he left the army, because basically he loves flying so much, and you get to a point in the army, I don't really know how the army works, but apparently you get to a point where you're not allowed to do anything more other than sit behind a desk. So the minute that happened, he said he left the army and went and became a test pilot for Westland helicopters. And because he'd flown the Apaches and all that kind of thing. But you know, he was just moving around all the time. And his wife, Rebecca, had the complete opposite childhood to him. And her father he wasn't in the military, but he had a job that again moved them every couple of years, and they'd lived in Australia for a bit, and they'd lived in Scotland, they'd lived all over the place. So you've got these two people, one who's had this unbelievably stable background, one who's had this completely peripatetic background, both of them now living this totally peripatetic life, and they've now got children. And Tim, of course, is thinking, oh, so bad for my boys, you know, we're moving them around everywhere and everything, whereas Rebecca's going, oh, they'll be fine. So he said it's taken them a while to actually go, okay, you know, and he's sort of won through at the moment. No, we're going to get a house, we're going to settle in one place. When I was talking to him, he said, it's a nightmare. So the minute the boys have left home, we're selling that house and we're getting a camper van. But he thought, again, that joy of moving around probably was exacerbated by the fact that he'd always had that safe haven to go back to.
I suppose because he knew it was possible.
Yeah.
And so you didn't have to keep proving that.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. And so after you left your non-perfect house in London, or perfect but therefore not perfect house, do you feel like you've sort of come full circle by ending up in Wales where you are?
Well, so that's the other thing. That was the other conundrum that I was sort of trying to unpick. I haven't. I mean, you don't expect you're going to get any answers from this book at all. But the weird thing that happened in the house that was never a home in London was that I started to hanker for the countryside again. I think probably I'd already been hankering for the countryside before we moved into the house. And it was that sort of thing of, if we move into a new house and have a big project, that will sort of overcome the fact that actually I just wanted to go back to somewhere muddy. Yes. And the odd thing was that I wasn't, people say maybe you're drawn back to your roots, but I wasn't drawn to going back to my childhood home. And, as you intimated, when I left that home, I had no wish to go back. I didn't feel remotely sad about leaving it. I've never been back. I've never driven past it. I've never even been back to the village. I just,
I find that so surprising.
I just didn't care. I was done. And then probably because my parents then left it 3 years later. Mm-hmm. So it really, really, really wasn't home. There was no connection anymore. But I just didn't feel the need to ever go back to it. But I did start having this pull to go back to the roots, my kind of muddy roots, the country roots. I just thought, I'm just not very good at living in a city. It doesn't really suit me. And the weirdest thing, and the thing that I will probably never understand, is that I had this longing. I now know there's a word for it. It's a Welsh word. But I had this absolute longing to live in Wales. I, as far as I know, have no Welsh ancestry, heritage, relatives. I'd never really even been. I had one weekend in the Brecon Beacons.
Geography field trip or
something like that. But I don't know what I really don't know what it was. I can't explain it at all. But this feeling was so strong. It was like this kind of visceral pit of the stomach longing. And there is a Welsh word for that feeling, which is untranslatable, and it's hideaways, I now know. Anyway, and Ludo just went, we can't go and live in Wales, that's ridiculous. People go on holiday to Wales, they don't actually live there. So we started kind of thinking, he's thinking, I've got this nightmare in my house, what am I going to do with her? So I think more as a sort of sop, we started looking like, were there places within driving distance of London that maybe could we afford to rent somewhere or something that, would sort of scratch the itch? And everything within striking distance of London is about £2 million, even, 18 years ago. And B, it wasn't scratching the itch because you've still got that hideous thing of sitting on the motorway for hours and hours and hours to go back to home that isn't home and you don't want to be there. So it just wasn't working. But then, and this is where I think there is a Tinkerbell or something out there, Ludo was offered a job in Cardiff. Get it! And it was only for a year. It was only a year's contract, but I was like, take it! I'm not sure I really want it. Yes, you do! You really do want that job. Poor boy. Anyway, he said, well, it's only for a year, so we'll rent and see if we like it. We'll love it! And then, we can't possibly sell our house in London because we'll never be able to afford to go back. Don't care! Anyway, as we girls know, I was thinking, get me over that bridge, I'm never going back. We never went back. And so we looked at, places to rent. Me sort of, playing along, thinking, nothing's going to work, it's not going to work. And actually, I don't know about this part of the world, but in Wales, when people say unfurnished, they're quite thorough. I mean, in London, unfurnished means bring your own sofa and your own bed. In Wales, unfurnished means bring your own kitchen. I mean, literally, there was a house we went to see and they said, this is the kitchen, this is the living room. And I'm like, they're identical. Apart from the fact there was maybe one pipe sticking out of the wall that you could have put a sink underneath. Or so. I mean, it literally, no light bulbs, never got a light bulb for free, certainly no curtains. I mean, literally. And I was like, I'm thinking, great. I said, this is ridiculous. We'd have to buy all this stuff when we've got it in London, you know. Why don't we just move here? and you know, and basically, gradually, I just sort of wore the poor bugger down. and we started looking, and this was the sort of the really weird thing. He and a very, very dear friend of ours did a bit of. I was away working in Iceland. I remember I was in Iceland, not the supermarket, and this very dear friend of ours went and did a bit of house hunting with Ludo, and I think it does help when somebody that you love dearly goes with you and goes, oh my goodness, this really is an amazing part of the world. So I think that was part of Ludo's thing, is that, you know, everyone they still think that Wales is at least 10 hours from anywhere, even Bristol, and that no one would come and see us ever if we moved to Wales. And so I think, you know, having the reassurance of this friend saying it's really not that far from London and it's really beautiful made Ludo think, oh, well, maybe we could
she's
do
not
this.
completely nuts.
She's not completely nuts. Well, I'm not sure he went that far. But, and so they started looking at places that, you know, it was sell everything and you know, properly commit. And they phoned me. I can remember I was in Reykjavik, and they were like kind of giggling, you know, like young lovers. I was thinking, blimey, I think I'm out of the equation. Saying, we've seen these lovely houses. And anyway, so we went down, Ludo and I went down then the following week to see these lovely houses. They weren't that lovely, to be honest. But there was one that I was really excited about. And you know, sometimes you look at the details and you've mentally furnished it already before you've even seen it. You think, yep, it's perfect. Anyway, the day before we were due to see it, the estate agent phoned up and said it's been sold. And I said, well, it can't possibly have been. It wasn't even under offer. And they said, oh, some people from London came in and paid over the asking price if we took it straight off the market. And I was like, bloody people from London? Ludo said, we're bloody people from London. I said, no, we're not like that, though. Anyway, they're very nice, actually. We now know them. And actually, thanks to them, is my mic off? Has it gone?
No.
Oh, sorry, everybody.
Oh, maybe more batteries? Hang on.
Have a look. Or I can just shout in an uncouth sort
I
of
think we
way.
have other batteries.
Oh, hang on. Has that gone back? That's back.
Ah, okay.
Oh, it's Bill's magic touch.
If it goes off, we might change the battery.
Okay. Yes, it was thanks to those bloody people from London that we then had to, keep looking. And this is in 2007. So, you know, Rightmove was sort of there, but the computers weren't. Anyway, we went into this little town and it had its computer shop and it had one computer that was run by mice. You know, and I put in, you know, top price, £5 million. I don't care. Anyway, and up came this house, and I said, "Oh my, not for £5 million." I hasten to add, but it was out of our price range. And I said to Ludo, "Oh my goodness, look at this place! It looks amazing." And he said, "Yeah, we can't afford it though." And I said, "Yeah, but you can always phone up and ask." And he said, "Okay." So I phoned up the estate agent, and as you know, you have to give your basically inside leg measurement before they'll tell you anything about anything. And I gave my name and they went, "Oh, it's the perfect house for you." And I said, "Well, shameless." And I said, "Well, I don't think it is, to be honest, because we can't afford it." "No, you have to go and see it. You so have to go and see it." And I said, "It has gone, hasn't it?"
There's some more behind there.
And it's fascinating, this, isn't it? Hold on. I don't know how to get in, Bill. Oh, there we are.
All right. Tried it.
There we go. I've talked so much, I've run out of double A's.
That's why we have a multi-pack. For the record, they drain when they're in these things. We're not just complete idiots.
There we go. How's that?
I ran out of Jeremy Paxman
Oh,
once.
hang on,
which was
does it need another flick?
I don't know if anyone was here then.
Might not. Oh, there
Oh,
we
you've
are.
turned
You've
it back
done
on.
Yeah.
Hello, hello.
Oh,
Yes,
that's
there
better.
we are.
We're up again.
Okay, we'll leave those there.
So rude. Where were we? Where were we?
The dodgy estate agent.
Oh, dodgy estate agent. Yeah. So you know, and I said, well, listen, I'm very happy to go and see it, but by me going to see it, you're telling me that either the owners are going to drop the price by a significant amount, not just, you know, a couple of quid, but a really, you know, here's our budget, and this is like above the budget. So if they're going to go, fine, I'll go and see it, or you're telling me that they don't mind that I'm just nosy and I want to go and see their house. Go and see it. And we said, great, okay, well, we've got another day, so arrange it. Turns out they were on holiday, the owners. So we couldn't go and see it. Except that I'm quite a nosy kind of... I was quite a good researcher. And so I did a little bit of... Anyway, we found... I think I know where it is. I think I found it. And that is no mean feat, because this house is in the middle of the woods, up a kilometre of forestry track. There's no road, there's no nothing.
No Google Maps at the time.
No Google Maps. And we are driving in our very urban Mini that is being scraped. Its bottom is being scraped up this really steep forestry track with kind of, you know, hairpin bends and everything. And it's August, and it's all beech and oak trees, and they're that heavy green, you know, and they've got this massive sort of canopy over the top. And anyway, we're driving up this track, and Ludo looks at me and says, "What are you thinking?" And I said, "Oh, I'm writing directions to our friends." I hadn't even seen what was at the top. And when we got to that, I mean, it's terribly naughty. I mean, we were completely trespassing, and there might have been somebody with a blunderbuss, you know. Anyway, we got to the top, and we didn't even look at the house. It was just, you know, we emerged out of the woods and onto the summit of this, or not actually quite the summit of this hill, but the top of a rise with the most incredible view over the Wye Valley. And bearing in mind we've been in Chiswick, you don't get views like that. And we just stood there, and I was doing. Some of you may know that interview that's in the Guardian, the Q&A questionnaire that's done in the Guardian
At the beginning,
beginning of the Saturday magazine, and I was doing that today. And Rosanna Greenstreet, who's done it, she's done it for over 30 years. That column.
Wow.
You know, the first question is, where were you happiest? And I said it was that moment when we just came out and we got out of our little Mini that was like kind of steaming, and we just stood on the top of that hill, and we looked at each other and went, why would we want to live anywhere else ever?
Wow.
And we hadn't even glanced at the house. But it was, and I don't understand why, but instantly it felt like home. And it is, you know, I've now lived there for 16 years, which is the longest I've lived anywhere in my adult life, and almost longer than I've lived anywhere. And it's the only place I've ever felt homesick for. It's really bizarre.
I think that's a very good note to see who would like to ask some questions. That's beautifully kind of rounded and a gorgeous image. Before I ask more questions, I think, yes, we're bang on time. Excellent. Who's got some questions? Go on, don't be shy. I can do that. Come on.
So if the house you're in feels like home, why do you want to then build another home?
That's a very good question. And the answer sounds a bit gloomy, but it's kind of not, because as I say, I love the kind of the challenge, that idea of building a house. And you know, one of the reasons that I wanted to write the book was, you know, how that house might be the home that I now, how will I emulate what I've got now? But the reason that I really want to build a house is I want to cheat fate. when my dad died in 2018, my mum had lived in the house that they had shared for lived there for over 30 years. And lots of us, I think, the kind of age we are, if I can lump you all into my ancient category, are seeing that happen to their parents, and their parents being in houses that they love, that all their memories are in, and yet it's not the most practical place for them to be, or the safest place for them to be. And my mum loved that house, but it had a really steep garden that she couldn't really manage anymore. It was an old house, the roof was about to fall in, you know, there were a lot of practical things. Plus, it had a stone floor and an open tread staircase. And as her daughter, I'm thinking, I'm going to have to come and scrape you off that floor one of these days if you're not careful. So I don't want that to happen. And persuading her to move was horrible for me, and it was horrible for her. She was incredibly brave, and in the end she did it. And she's unbelievably happy. And the reason that she's done so well, and she actually did say to me the other day, she said, I can't quite believe I'm saying this, but you were right. See her spitting. And the reason she is so happy where she is now is she has moved approximately 300 metres up the same road. So in a much smaller, much more manageable, little courtyard garden, all the people that she loves. And she's one of those people who always invited people in, you know, when new people moved to the village, she'd have them in, you know, so she's got friends of every age, and that's really important for her. It's really important for me as well, because it means that, you know, I don't worry about her as much, although I never get to see her because she's so busy. But I'm really conscious that the house that we live in now, it's a 4-acre small holding. It's also on very steep land. It's up a very rutted, very difficult track. And one day I won't be able to manage it. We won't be able to manage it. And also, it's such a special place that it would be a waste for 2 old people who can't get up the stairs to moulder away in one room. So I want to cheat fate. And I haven't got kids who are going to wag their finger at me and say, you've got to move, which might be a nice thing, but actually I know that one day I will have to. And so if I preempt it and build the place that is perfect, then it won't be such a wrench to leave the place that I love so much now. And when we've talked about it a lot, and we were saying, well, where would it be? You know, we have this kind of luxury of, we could potentially build it anywhere. I mean, you know, obviously we won't get into the practicalities of planning and all those boring things. But, you know, if you have your sort of dream house, where would it be? And we were thinking, and that was kind of part of the root of this book as well. Where would it be? We could build it, you know, in Spain or in France, or my husband speaks French, loves France, grew up in France, you know, should we build it in France? Should we? And ultimately, you know, when we were picking away, and as I was writing this book, we actually realised that there are all sorts of things about where we are that make us feel at home. So we will build, if we're allowed to, by our local planning authority, who hate me, we will build quite close, I think, to where we are now. But that's the reason. So it's sort of partly pragmatic and partly, I just want to prove that even though I can't put a shelf up, I can build a house.
Any other questions? No? Oh, just here.
Not so much a question, but just a cautionary note.
Oh, goodness. Go on.
My late mother, who was a trained architect and had lived in quite a number of houses throughout her life, decided to build herself a house.
Mm-hmm.
And so she knew exactly what she wanted, how it was going to be, and all the things that were wrong with all the houses she'd ever lived in. She got rid of those, and so it was going to be perfect. And when she moved in, it wasn't. It wasn't perfect.
Do you know?
She kept saying to her, "Why did I do that? Why did I suggest putting that there?"
Well, yes, that is very good. But I wonder, Do you think it was her architect's mind that thought it wasn't perfect? Because obviously I'm not one of those, so it's not going to bother me that, you know, I've got a random corner.
No, it was just an impractical place for the door. There was a more
Right.
practical place to put that.
Right.
Door, for example.
Yeah. But did she enjoy living in it?
She did.
Okay.
Enormously.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So it's a cautionary but happy tale.
Yeah.
That's definitely a win.
Phew.
Any questions from over here? All being shy? Here we go.
The sense of home then actually the location rather than the physical building structure?
Well,
Because you said you went up your
Yeah.
track and there was this fantastic view, saw the house. It didn't matter what the
Yeah.
house was. And that with us
It's the same thing.
It's the same thing.
I think it is very different for. I mean, this was actually the relief of writing this book was finding out that not everybody thinks the same, you know, and home is different for, all that sense of home is different for different people. But I think sense of location or view is a very compelling part of home. Another couple that I met in Shetland, thanks to Willie Dool, was this brother and sister called Ruby and another Willie, Ruby and Willie Brown. And when I was at the Dool's house and we were talking, and because they were the very, very first people that I interviewed for the book, and they said, you know, who else or what other people are you hoping to interview? And my childhood home caught fire when I was about 6, and my mum, who is always cold, had an electric blanket, which in the 70s was a very bad idea because they just blew up, and hers blew up. Luckily, with her not in the bed, and you know, she got us all out, and the house was saved. But there is a particular smell of wet soot now that takes me back to being 6 again. But we were very lucky, you know, the house was basically fine. Mum got a new bed, didn't get an electric blanket, you know, let the cat sleep on the bed instead, which was a much better idea to stay warm. But I wondered what it was like if you lost your house through fire, you know, how do you recreate a home? And when I was with the Dools, they said, you know, I said someone I'd like to talk to is somebody who's maybe lost their house by fire. And they said, oh, you need to speak to Ruby and Willie. And being Shetland, they bundled me into the car and we, you know, drove around the coast, and they said, we think they live over there, you know, I'll pop in. Anyway, and out comes Willie Brown and says, yes, come on in, we'll chat. And their story was extraordinary because they had been born in the croft that their parents had moved to in 1922. And exactly 100 years later, so in February 2022, Willie and Ruby both still living there. Parents have died since then. Willie had his room upstairs, Ruby had her room downstairs, and there was a huge storm raging. I'm sure you all know, you know, Shetland does weather quite well in a dramatic sort of fashion. And I mean, you can buy the book and read the whole story, obviously, but the croft was struck by lightning, and they're 3 miles from a road where there's any sort of signal, and so they managed to get out, but literally, Ruby was in her pyjamas with a jumper over the top. She said she was only able to get out. She said, "Thank God I'd had my hip done. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to climb out the window." I mean, literally, she had to climb out the window because the house was full of smoke. And they drove in Willie's truck up to the road because he'd had it was literally just force of habit. He got up, put his trousers and shirt on to investigate this burning smell and put his truck keys in his pocket. Otherwise, he wouldn't have had that either. They drove up, they alerted the authorities, and as they were driving back, the whole croft was on fire, the roof. So they knew, you know, it was gone. And I met them, it was about 4 months after it had happened. Now, anyone who knows any sort of small community, particularly island communities, they're incredibly tight-knit. And they lost everything. everything. Literally all they had was what they were standing up in. And the community were, you know, someone said, we've got a house, it's a holiday cottage, we'll, you know, just come and live in that. People literally, Ruby said it was extraordinary, people were queuing up with bags of clothes and cooking equipment and everything. But what was so strange about going into the house that they were in when I went to visit them was that it had no feeling of being a home. And even though I didn't know the story at that point, I walked in and thought, God, it feels really there's a word I discovered, there's a German word. If anyone speaks German, I'm really sorry because I know I'm probably going to pronounce it wrong, but it's Stimmung. And it sort of translates as an atmosphere of home, and I think we all know it. You all know when you walk into a house, it has a sort of either a feeling of being kind of warm and cosy, or it doesn't quite. And this just, it felt very temporary. And when I was talking to them about what they missed and how do you deal with that? And they lost all their history, you know, not just boring things like passports and bank cards, but everything, all the photographs, all the books, all the kind of memories had all gone. And for them, it was the view. It was that piece of land, and they're crofters, you know, they've been raising animals and Ruby's garden and it's the view. And actually now they're living on a static caravan back there because they just couldn't bear to not be on that piece of land. But then there are other people, you know, like Barry and Wayne, for example, who, you know, they live on their boat, and at the moment the view doesn't change because they ran out of money, so they have to stay in one harbour to make some money to, you know. So, and then for other people it might be possessions, or it might be things like, you know, just a connection with people or with family. I mean, somebody I talked to, in fact, the woman whose illustration is the cover of the book, which was rather lovely. She'd been an accountant, never really wanted to be an accountant, wanted to be an artist anyway. So that's her illustration. But she is more about stuff because she grew up. Her father was a bit hopeless, very hopeless by the sounds of things. So she grew up in this kind of chaotic house and they just didn't have the money for carpets and curtains. So it never felt cosy and it was always freezing. And so for her, carpets and curtains are the thing that give her a home. So it was that's what I loved about doing this, was that everybody I spoke to had a different sense of home. And one of the most moving of all, I spoke to 2 refugees. One was Syrian, so she's never going back to Syria, can't go back to Syria. And one was a Ukrainian woman who is hoping, obviously, to go home as soon as possible. She hasn't managed it yet, but she's hoping. And for her, I said, what do you bring with you? She was really torn about leaving Ukraine. But I said, what do you bring with you and she's got a small daughter as well. And she said, I couldn't bring anything because if I brought any of the things from home, it would make me feel too sad. So I have to bring home with me here. I just have to bring a memory. And for Jana, the Syrian woman whose story, it's mind-blowing, her story, isn't it? It's absolutely, she's only in her early 30s and what she's been through is so extraordinary. And, you know, she didn't just lose her home, she lost her community, her family, her language, her culture, everything. And through a circuitous route, she had it sometime in Turkey. She came to the UK because she's got a profoundly disabled son, and the medical profession in Turkey just didn't know how to look after him. And the UN, she eventually sought help. She's an incredibly proud woman. And she eventually sought help from the UN, who said, we'll try and get you somewhere that your son can have proper medical treatment. And by this stage, she's had the most traumatic time in Turkey of being, you know, an outcast, someone who doesn't speak the language, treated so badly. It's just unbelievable. And she came to the UK because she had a sister in Cardiff. So she actually came to Wales. And again, she's thinking, it's another language that I'm going to have to get my head around. And another is going to be even worse because I'm Muslim and people aren't Muslim and, you know, or not so many people are Muslim, and so I'm going to be even more of an outsider. And her whole thing was, right, the only way we're going to do this is we'll get medical help for my son, and when we know that he can be looked after and treated properly, and we are here long enough to get a passport, because if you're a refugee, you don't have a passport, you don't have anything. I mean, everything is taken away from you. So as soon as we get our passport, we go back to Turkey, because even though they had such a difficult time there, she thought, well, at least there's a shred of familiarity there now, and she'd been there, you know, she was beginning to get the language and everything. And she said, that was till, and it's going to make me cry, she said, that was until I realised how kind everyone was. And she said, the minute I got here, everyone helped me. And she said, it was my home. And she's such an amazing woman. She's been here for 5 years. And I sat on her sofa for 2.5, probably 3 hours talking to her in English. She has been to college every day, every single day to learn English. She's astonishing. She's got 3 children. They are the most delightful kids. And her little boy, who was 10 when they arrived, and he's got spinal muscular atrophy, and he's in a wheelchair. He's now about to do his GCSEs. He is going to be president of the world. That's amazing. It's the most amazing kid. And they're just the most fantastic family. But it was a lovely, for me, it was the most incredible thing to hear that, again, for her, even though she'd lost everything, and she was having to make a home in somewhere that was so different. I mean, Newport, South Wales couldn't be more different from Aleppo if it tried. And yet, that kindness of the people around her, she said, this is home. So, amazing. Yeah. Made us all cry.